Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to open the next session and in so doing introduce to you our next keynote speaker, Jody Glean Mitchell. She is an award-winning anti-racism practitioner who has dedicated her professional career to developing educational programming in the field of anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. Jody got her master's degree of Arts in Educational Studies from Concordia University in Canada and is presently undertaking her PhD program at York University in Ontario, Canada, with research focusing on the experience of equity practitioners in advancing racial equity and inclusion in post-secondary institutions. She brings more than 10 years of experience working in the field of anti-racism, equity, and inclusion, and she's worked with several community organizations and government services to support critical dialogues and action plans to increase racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Currently, she serves as the Interim Executive Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Toronto, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to her and for her to give her presentation to us this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever we are. Over to you, Jody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Eleanor. Thank you to the organizers for holding this space and for the invitation to participate. I am fully excited. I have my cup of coffee ready to go. I hope everyone, regardless of the time of day, is very much energized for this conversation. I just want to say thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to our engagement. Please note that throughout my conversation with you, and that's all this is going to be, it's just a dialogue with each of you. I may be inviting some questions. So please get ready, stretch, move around, do what you need to, but ensure you have access to your chat, because as we engage collectively on what we know is a very important part of the work that we do, which is addressing equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in our work and in our institutions. This work requires a collective voice. I think what the last 2 years have reminded us is that our silence does not serve us in this work. And so really wanting to invite you to find your voice, find your space in this really important conversation from whatever approach or angle or area of interest that may be. Okay. And so, of course, wanting to take a moment to acknowledge that I am joining you from particularly the province of Ontario and the country of Canada, from a very particular space known as the municipality of Clarington. And so really important for me to acknowledge that in this particular area where I am now working remotely, given the times that we are in, that this particular land belongs to the treaty territory of the Mississaugas and Chippewas of the Anishinaabe, known today as the Williams Treaties First Nations. Okay, really wanting to invite that when we engage in equity, diversity, and inclusion work, regardless of our geographical spaces, that is important to really take the time to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land, that the persons who were here first, the persons who were nurturing the land, the persons who were caretaking this space, upon which many of our wisdoms and knowledges are built upon, right? So I really want to acknowledge that Indigenous communities throughout the globe ought to be honored and valued, and it is their expertise, their wisdom that really informs equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism work. And so really wanting to give space and a moment of honoring to these communities. And of course, it is February 27th today, and within North America, particularly within Canada, we are still celebrating Black History Month. So also wanting to honor and bring into the space our African ancestors, those throughout the globe, across the diaspora, wanting to acknowledge all of the freedom fighters who have engaged, but even beyond that, wanting to acknowledge the leadership, the majesty, the royalty of Black ancestry, African ancestry, in its many forms. And so really just wanting to bring in some voices. I have Maya Angelou on the slide, but I come from a particular area in the Caribbean, and there have been a number of champions of growth and prosperity, champions of innovation, champions in every sector across the world. And I just want to give space and celebration to folks of African descent from the African diaspora across the world and the globe. All right, so let's begin. Okay, listen. There's no way that I could come in and talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion and its importance and not acknowledge that within the past 2 years plus, including current day, we have been navigating some of the messiest, chaotic, violent of times. And so to each and every one of you on this call that have been impacted, whether in a very personal way, maybe we lost loved ones to the pandemic, whether we continue to lose loved ones to the impacts of the pandemic, whether we are losing, whether we are engaged in a bit of anger and trauma and frustration as a result of the different inequities, the barriers, the challenges that the world and globe and varying communities have been navigating. I want you to know that I see you and I hold you during this time. I am wanting to give space and acknowledge the situation, the events that are unfolding in Ukraine and Russia. I see you and I hold you during this time. And we know that in times of war and unrest, it is the most vulnerable of populations that feel and experience the most detrimental of impacts. I see you and I hold you during this time. These spaces, whether they're academic or conference or conference spaces, or whether we're looking at science or the arts, we're still people in these spaces living through and experiencing real life arenas. And I see you and I hold you during this time. But it is in seeing all of what we've been navigating, I also wanted to bring in some of the most current context, because let's be real, let's make sure we're clear. Many of the systemic barriers, the inequities, the challenges, these moments in time that we've experienced within the last 2 years did not start within the last 2 years. Conversations on racism, anti-Black racism, addressing sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, the many ways exclusions against persons with disabilities continue to impact their lives, the inequities in our healthcare system, in our criminal policing and justice system, the media, in education, right? These are not new conversations. Racism has been in existence for 400 plus years. Sexism, heterosexism, ableism, ageism has been in existence for many centuries, right? But we have been reminded in the last few years about its importance to not stop talking about it, about the importance of knowing that we are not living in a post anything as it relates to the isms. We have been reminded that in our own work, in our sectors, in our research, in the areas in the problems that we are trying to solve, that we have an additional responsibility to cast our net wider, to take a look at, to take just an even more in-depth look at the respective community, at our respective communities, right? It is important that we ensure that as we think through new innovations, think through how we guide our way through the pandemics, that we ensure that all of our work is taking into account the uniqueness of the communities that your work, the important and critical work that your research and what you're doing in labs and in practicum is in how it impacts the communities that will be engaging with your work that you do. The work that you do in the science fields is extremely critical. This we know. And we are so very thankful for your expertise and contributions. And what we're asking for is to not ignore what history has taught us, to not ignore what present day is showing us, so that we can ensure that the future work is built with just a little bit more trust in the system. It's built with a little bit more kindness and compassion, and allowing for many more communities to engage with the important work that you do. And so really wanting to acknowledge that when I think about equity, diversity, and inclusion work in academia, across a global sphere, I'm always very mindful that within your respective countries and cultures and societies, these conversations and topics may look differently, but there may also be some common trends, right? And so I wanted to really think about, if I was to come into your space and ask, how are you defining equity and diversity and these terms that are on the slide, you know, it may have a different season, it may have a different flavor involved, but really wanting to acknowledge that there are also some common, some common themes built within these terms that I am excited to know and to learn about how they're explored in your respective institutions and in your work. So whether we're looking at equity, and we know with equity, you're looking at both the historical and the present day, acknowledging that historically and present day, there have been some barriers. There's been barriers for many communities based on identities, right? Barriers that were experienced because of how we have socially constructed our identities around race, around our gender identities, around our sexual identities, around our different abilities, around our age. And that has informed who is valued and who is not valued. And so what equity is saying is that because this is the reality of the space, that we may need to engage in different techniques, provide different resources, engage in different programmings to ensure that the communities and the diversity of the communities that we're serving all have access to the same opportunities. Okay. When I think about diversity, we know we're talking about differences. We know that these differences may be visible and not visible. We're not only talking about visibility of identities that we think we know based on sight, but also thinking about one's journeys, one's perspectives, one's opinions. And the piece around diversity in this context is for the need to increase it in our respective sectors, increasing them in our institutions, so that we can continue to have that diversity of thought and engagement in the work that we do. Who is underrepresented in our institutions, in our areas of faculty, in our graduate degrees, who have been able to access certain areas and who has not been able to access certain areas. Noting there's a few comments in the chat there. Awesome, right? Thank you for that, Professor Eleanor. When I think about inclusion, some common themes, we're talking about the active and ongoing engagement with different perspectives. It means that, yes, you may want to increase representation, but when I'm thinking about inclusion, it means that you actually want to hear what I got to say. And you're going to take it into account in a serious way. We're going to unpack it, and we may debate it, and we might challenge it, but it's being taken up with value and ensuring that there's value of the different perspectives, right? And then when I think about anti-racism, and I'm positioning anti-racism very distinctly within this context, because this is my research and work. Anti-racism is saying, listen, we gotta make sure we have an ongoing lens, a way within which we understand our world, our sector, how we're making decisions, and we have to make sure we're continuously analyzing for barriers. And what anti-racism work is saying is that you have to center a racial analysis in that unpacking of the status quo. Why are things are the way they are? What have we determined to be the norm? What's the normal way of doing things? How did that come to be? And when you keep asking those questions, you have to talk about the role of colonialism in our respective histories and the role colonialism has played in how we've come to just do things. So whose knowledges are valued? Whose ways of doing, ways of science and research and engagement, which pathway is valued over others? And how did we come to make that decision, right? So that's what anti-racism work is saying. We must continuously be in that posture of questioning. Right? And at the end of the day, it says, listen, there's a bigger picture. I don't care where you live. I don't care what institution you are representing. I don't care if you are, I don't care how diverse your institution is. There is always this bigger picture that there's people are experiencing different barriers, and sometimes it comes in the form of discrimination, that there's power and different advantages that people have just because of who they are. That's what EDIA work says. And because of that, there's all these isms and phobias that exist. Racism, sexism, heterosexism, there's homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, right? These are real lived experiences from the communities that we serve. And so because they exist, it means it shows up in different ways. It's showing up in our policies because there's a regular way within which we do things that we need to start questioning and disrupt. And then there's ways that it shows up on the day-to-day in individual attitudes and how we've been socialized, right? And all of this bigger picture means that it's just reinforcing more barriers. It's being a barrier to various resources, including employment and education and the healthcare system, right? So EDIA work is saying the bare minimum is that you have to understand this is existing. We may not agree on how it's unfolding. We may not agree on how it's manifesting, but you have to sit in that space and knowing that the work, the important work that you are doing is happening in this context. Right? All right. And when I talk about systemic barriers, I just wanted to provide a brief definition. And I'm adapting a definition from Professor Carl James from York University, who utilized this definition particularly in defining systemic racism. But I think it's very much applicable across identity-based barriers, right? And so when you talk about systemic barriers, many times people may it may be positioned in the realm of policies and practices of an organization or the policy and practice of your university, of your institution. And Professor James says, no. Think about it even that much more nuanced, where it is the relationship between the individual forms of barriers and how it's expressed and how it's engaged in that day-to-day. It's the institutional form. So indeed, our policies, our practices, the ways we make decisions in our institutions, as well as the structural or societal, the ways within which our laws, the policies and guidelines for funding, the ways within which for grant funding, so the ways within which some of the structural elements of what guides our work in academia is also reinforcing barriers for communities. And what Professor James is saying is that it's the relationship between the three of these areas that result in systemic barriers, right? So really just wanting to provide this definition for consideration when you think through systemic barriers, right? And that terminology, right? And so if I was to ask, what systemic barriers manifest in the STEM field in academia? And what are the common barriers across the research ecosystem? Start throwing that in the chat for me, right? They may be, you may take some particular areas into consideration. We may be talking about from a gender perspective, who's in, who's out, who is missing from our tables, or which identities are not fully present as they ought to be, given the communities within which we serve, right? What are some of those common barriers, whether it's around funding, whether it's around areas around access, whether it's in regards to it could just be access to varying terminologies and opportunities to engage in academia and in bringing it more squarely into the STEM field. Really wanting to, thank you, I see representation in the chat, really wanting folks to think about what barriers look like in your respective contexts. Because you cannot engage in EDIA work if we don't know what the gaps are. And what's the work in being able to identify the gaps? Are we having those consultations with community? Okay. And so really wanting to bring in some of the areas and work that's being done in EDIA from a particularly from a Toronto Canadian context, and really wanting to invite, if there's great work happening in your respective areas, throw them in the chat too. You may be a part of some fantastic initiatives that's happening. Please ensure that we're sharing all of this, right? But it's important. One of the first steps in addressing any form of systemic barriers in academia is to identify it. You have to be able to recognize it. You have to call it, right? Whether it's around colorism, whether it's around class, we have to be, whether it's around gender, whether it's around sexual identities. We have to be able to say, this is where the gaps are, this is where we're falling short, so that we can put the pieces in place in order to address it, okay? And so when I think about your journey, right, and I may just be reinforcing the elements that you already know, where there's some key considerations to be given to the equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism journey. You got to position the self, then you got to think about the work that you do, and then you got to think about what it means to engage in this work collectively in community, okay? And so when we think about the self, very quickly, wanting to invite folks to throw in the chat for me, if given some of the areas that I talked about around equity, diversity, and inclusion, what would you say are some of the key qualities of an EDIA leader? What are some of the traits that one needs to be able to have? I see here, how to empower the underrepresented in institutions where authority will penalize them. Okay, so there we go. And so when I read that from Professor Eleanor, I hear courage, the ability to address, the ability to listen to others' experiences. Here we go, some deep listening. Talk to me. Being able to lead, leading by example. All right, thank you, right? And I'm going to keep throwing your engagements in the chat, and I'm going to add to that established list, right? So one, you got to be able to acknowledge identities as a whole, whether it's around race, whether it's around gender, as mentioned, right? You also have to engage in ongoing, and I see empathy, thank you for that. You also have to be able to engage in ongoing education. This work requires work. This work is work, right? And it means that similar to the important work that you're doing in STEM, it means that in EDIA work, we also got to go to those conferences. We got to engage in our professional development in this area. If there are gaps and barriers impacting communities of which I don't belong, I need to learn about them, right? So that I can engage in my work in a fulsome way. Right? You got to be able to know where power and privilege lies in this conversation for you. Who has advantages and disadvantages? How are they experienced? And then for all of knowing that all of us hold some space of power, how are we using it responsibly? What does solidarity and allyship look like? How am I championing certain causes in this really important context in the work that we do? And it's important to take a stand. Be clear that discrimination and harassment has no place in your class, in your learning environment, in your research teams, in your faculties, and it must be backed with action. Right? It's important for us to take a stand on different areas of importance. Encourage responsible dialogue, very similar to the acknowledgement of race. We also got to raise its visibility. We have to be willing to speak about it. And it doesn't matter from which area you may be engaging in this work, whether you think, why are we talking about identities? Why do identities still matter? Why are we still taking this thing up, right? It's okay if that's a perspective that we hold, right? But it's important for us to talk about it so that we can engage and learn, so that we can collectively sharpen our tools, okay? Because it's important to know that there are no shortcuts to this work. There are no shortcuts to EDIA work. And also wanting to highlight here that engagement in EDIA work is a choice. It's a choice. It's either you care or you don't care. There's no legal obligation to think about how your research is impacting varying communities. It's a choice. There's no legal obligation to want to engage in efforts to increase representation of diverse gender identities and sexual identities, and to ensure that within our respective spaces, that racialized identities are present. That's a choice to take that up. But it's a choice that we're highly calling you to engage. right? And very important for us to think through the concept of intersectionality. No one person is one singular identity, right? And as a result of that, it means that because of all of who I am, I identify as a Black woman who's a mom, who was born outside of Canada, who comes from a particular education background, who engages in a particular faith. All of who I am is engaging with you right now. And so that means my experiences with barriers and or challenges is very unique to me and to the identities that I hold. And what intersectionality is saying is that when you're thinking about your change efforts, the things that you want to address, the gaps that you're trying to address, whether it's in your research or whether it's in your institution, that you center this principle of intersectionality to think about the fullness of who someone is, okay? I had a video, but we won't have time to play it at the moment, but it's a video link that I can share, which just defines intersectionality a bit more. Right? And so wanting to engage in my closing, thinking about the work and with some tools. And so wanting to highlight that with the work, there'd be many calls to action, especially within the last 2 years. Right? Many, with the murder of George Floyd, may George Floyd rest in peace in the United States of America. But knowing that the focus on anti-Black racism and institutional violence did not start there. Those conversations did not start there. There's been ongoing calls for different organizations and faculties and universities to really think through what is my role here? What part am I playing in this conversation, right? And so wanting to just highlight some of the key calls to action that folks have been grappling with, which includes calls to action across Canada that has taken place. And many times, many of those calls to action centered some common themes, which include wanting to address the lack of diverse representation of our faculty members, wanting to ensure that our complaints reporting mechanisms were strengthened so that when folks did engage in inappropriate behavior, that someone knew what to do, what they wanted to address it. There was calls to take a look at the curriculum. How are we decolonizing it or diversifying the curriculum? Really inviting you to engage with these different terms and concepts as you move forward. You know, what is it, when I take a look at the structures, can everybody engage? Are my programs full-time or part-time? For folks who may need to work and go to school at the same time, does my program allow them to do so, right? So what are the funding opportunities available? And what are the barriers in current funding opportunities? Do we need to rethink what funding opportunities have been looking like, right? So there's been a number of different calls to action over the course of time, over the course of the 2 years that universities have been called to grapple with particularly. So really wanting to invite you to reflect on what have been the calls for change in your respective institutions and where have you or will you lend your voice and your time, right? How actively are we going to engage, whether it's in our academic studies or whether it's within our institution directly, right? And so going into the community tools for change that are for ones to think about, I wanted to center two. I wanted to center the role of anti-racism pedagogy. So inviting folks to think through this concept some more, go and engage in some ongoing learning. And what anti-racism pedagogy is saying, it's saying there's a different way within which we ought to be engaging in our learning environments. And again, this has global reach. It does not matter which country you are representing or from or where your institution is based. It's saying that we need to rethink how we engage in our classroom environments, right? And some of that rethinking means, you know, how are we challenging assumptions? How are we developing student awareness in certain social positions? How are we empowering students and applying theory to practice, right? So really wanting to invite that anti-racism pedagogy, say be critical, challenge, build community, right? That's an essential component of this work is the role of community in the classroom. As colleagues and students engage in the STEM fields, challenge, you know, let's ensure that we're critically analyzing the work that we're doing. Are we, with this important work that's impacting the public health sector, have I thought about these unique communities which will have, which are currently engaged and experiencing vulnerable impacts? How does my work impact them, right? Who is missing from our conversations, right? And then the last tool to think about is that collective commitment. And I just wanted to highlight two examples of what collective commitment in this work has looked like. So one's coming from the Chemical Institute of Canada, where they put out a call to action. And here are some of the commitments of which they said that they were going to engage in. And this was, of course, within a Canadian context, very specific to wanting to address anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, but really thinking about what does this translate to in your respective areas? Maybe it's not centered around race, maybe it's centered around different varying identities, but wanting to invite what have we been committing to within our institutions and organizations. Within the University of Toronto, we have a Research Reach Alliance team, right? And they recently in 2020 had put forward Edia charter, right? Where all members, students, faculty, mentors engaged in this programming within the Reach Alliance are now had to be oriented around around some particular value sets as it relates to doing equity, diversity, and inclusion work as they engage in international research and international development research. Okay, so really just wanting to provide that there's some key tools for change as it relates to EDIA work, and that includes how we do things differently in our learning environments as it's applicable to your respective societies. And then as well as when you think about the work and the research, how are we doing this in a collective way, right? And so as we leave our time together, just wanting to invite that question, this call to action. What do you commit to? How are we collectively engaging and deepening our work in EDIA change in your research practices and in your institution? Okay. And so to that, I'm going to come to an end. I know I'm 2 minutes over time, but wanting to just leave some moments for Q&A if time permits. So thank you, everyone. I hope I contributed in some way to your learning journeys moving forward.
Thank you so much for that talk. Thank you for bringing this conversation to all of us. That was very insightful. Thank you. And I'd like to move on to some questions. I firstly have one. I recently attended another talk where some of the discussion was around the role of mentorship in inclusivity and diversity, and how important it can be to have a mentor who represents you or represents something that you see within yourself in institutions that can sort of help guide younger members of the institution. What's your experience with that? Do you think that's something we should be pushing forward?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Mentorship and the championing. There's another term or evolution term around a championship. So there's mentorship and championship are also, you could even add that as tool number 3 to that slide deck. Thank you for bringing that forward. I am because my mentor filled and poured into me, right? For where I am today was not just because, it was because there was someone who led and guided me throughout my professional career, particularly within fields where there is a lack of representation of racial diversity, gender diversity, different ages and different abilities in spaces of decision-making and leadership. And we know that within the STEM field, this has been a central focus, I would say, within the last decade, that mentorship is a key tool for folks to be able to see themselves. I had somebody say recently, representation is important because it symbolizes possibility. And so when you think about the role of mentorship after representation, it says not only is it possible, but I'm going to chart the pathway forward for you. I'm going to help support your pathway forward. So it is indeed a key tool.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I think
Hi there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jody. So I guess you know, I've listened to what you say, and I'm sure all our audience is absolutely convinced that this must happen in our academic institutions. But then I see, you know, I can point to the University of Toronto, where you know, issues surrounding hate precludes inclusion. I mean, just recently, I'm sure you're aware of it, our student body, our student union, sanctioned and passed a vote that prohibited the purchase of certain religious food for a group in our university, which is absolutely stunning. So we have these institutions in place at U of T, Reach being one of them, and yet this still goes on. So you talk about courage, but I'm wondering, when the voice of hate is so loud, how do you actually, you know, call them to order? How do, as we as individuals can make a difference?
Fantastic question. Thank you. And I want to take that question even one step further back. Hate has always been present, right? Regardless of the form that it has taken. Hate is part of what informs, part of the foundation of historical oppressions, whether you're looking at Holocaust, slavery. In Canada, we had a system known as a residential school system. I believe within your own respective histories of your geographical locations, you will be able to identify those markers of what hate has looked like, right? But it has also morphed and evolved over the last few years. What it used to look like, what anti-Black racism prominently looked like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, particularly in North America, though there's still examples and instances of it when you think about someone like Ahmaud Arbery and what they went through, yet there's still more subtler ways. There's, depending on the space and within your cultural context, you know what I mean when I say it has evolved. There's a subtle nuance to it. It's not as direct and blatant anymore. And so first wanting to say is that in order to address hate, and thank you for using that term hate, because all forms of isms is a violence, right? It's violent, it has emotional, mental, and very much physical impacts on a body. The first step is to be able to identify what it is, right? You have to be able to acknowledge, raise it, talk about it, make it visible in your institutions. Also keep in mind that many times in institutions, you're not the lone voice. So find community, find the spaces and the champions, both in administration, in faculty, and of course, among student groups of who also care about what you are raising and the issues that you're raising. And then I would say, listen, make sure you have fulsome information. Not all things are as they seem. Many things, I can assure you that social media is not the primary place to get our information and our news, right? So many times things hit the media and the news, but they're not exactly as they seem. And I would say one of the things that has been remiss in current day is the art of dialogue. We have been so remiss, or we have been so engaged in what I call cancel culture, and what I call sort of that robust mass advocacy activism, that we've stopped the art of asking, what happened here? Is what I'm reading exactly what happened? Oh, that's a missing piece of information going on here, right? Because when we get that type of information, then we're that much more informed in how we can move forward to address it, right? So really wanting to invite dialogue and deep listening as we continue to move forward in addressing the many forms of violence that hate can take. I hope that adds, okay, awesome. Thank you for that question.